Good morning. We don't always know what's going on with people. And sometimes imagining that can make a big difference. How many of you have seen the movies Inside Out? One or two. Fairly popular. If you haven't seen it, it is actually worth seeing even as an adult, or if you have a child or grandchild to drag you into it. Because it's this funny narrative of how thoughts are formed and are in conflict with one another all along the way. And it actually has some really good things to say about how we think, how we fear, how we love, and how we change. I bring you this movie recommendation by way of illustration that I think that we get a little bit of that view in this ongoing narrative of Pilate. Now, we don't have fear and anxiety and joy arguing with each other. But we certainly have this person who is supposed to be powerful, who's supposed to be in charge, doing his best to figure out what is going on here. And we see a little bit of the conflict that is here. I'd like to continue our story in that vein. This is John 19, verses 1 through 16. Then Pilate had Jesus taken and whipped. The soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head and dressed him in a purple robe. Over and over again they went out to him and said, "Greetings, King of the Jews." And then they slapped him in the face. Pilate came out of the palace again and said to the Jewish leaders, "Look, I'm bringing him out to you to let you know that I find no ground for a charge against him." When Jesus came out, wearing the crown of thorns and a purple robe, Pilate said to them, "Here's the man." When the chief priests and their deputies saw him, they shouted, "Crucify, crucify!" Pilate told them, "You take him and crucify him. I don't find any ground for a charge against him." The Jewish leaders replied, "We have a law, and according to this law, he ought to die because he made himself out to be God's son." When Pilate heard this word, he was even more afraid. He went back into the residence and spoke to Jesus. "Where are you from?" Jesus didn't answer. So Pilate said, "You won't speak to me. Do you not know what authority I have to release you and also to crucify you?" Jesus replied, "You would have no authority over me if it had not been given you from above. That's why the one who handed me over to you has the greater sin." From that moment on, Pilate wanted to release Jesus. However, the Jewish leaders cried out, saying, "If you release this man, you are no friend of the emperor. Anyone who makes himself out to be king opposes the emperor." When Pilate heard these words, he led Jesus out and seated him on the judge's seat at a place called the Stone Pavement, in Aramaic, Gabbatha. It was about noon on the preparation day for the Passover. Pilate said to the Jewish leaders, "Here is your king." The Jewish leaders cried out, "Take him away! Take him away! Crucify him!" Pilate responded, "What? Do you want me to crucify your king?" "We have no king but except the emperor," the chief priests answered. Then Pilate handed Jesus over to be crucified. This, again, is one of these stops on the way to the cross that everyone knows and is familiar with, but no one quite knows what to do with. If you go looking for sermonic background on this verse, as I did this week, you're not going to find a whole lot. The Revised Common Lectionary, the list of readings that the large majority of the church reads from day to day, does not mention this text. It's set on a Good Friday observation and the Stations of the Cross. The whole chapter is ignored because it's a part of the Passion story that are read for the rude facts that they are and left at that. There's no easy answer. There's barely a message of hope. And there's not even a go and do likewise message unless you want to put Jesus, Pilate, as one of the premier advocates for good hand hygiene. Yet, we know that he was one of the pivotal people in the whole saga. He seems to hold a great deal of sway here, even as he's pushed this way and that by those who swirl around him. It's worth asking, what do we make of Pilate at the end of it all? And there is no real clarity on that. Pilate is one of these biblical characters where rarely we have actually contemporary historical accounts of. And Pilate appears to have served as the fifth governor of the Roman province of Judea, a role he held according to Josephus for 10 years. Appointed under Emperor Tiberius, Pilate would have been responsible for leading the regional military, overseeing the judicial system, and collecting and levying taxes and minting coins. He was the person that ran the government in this area. And there's disagreement on how good he was. Some say, well, he stayed there for 10 years, so he must have had something going for him. He was the second longest serving governor of the region. But then on the other side, it's pointed out, well, this is a fairly low status appointment, and he was never promoted, so how good could he be? You have both. And a lot of chroniclers, both Josephus and Philo, portray him as a cruel and obstinate man with little regard for the traditions around him. Yet it was Pilate who would appoint and maintain the high priest and the religious authorities. The Christian thought is equally ambiguous. He is noted in the Apostles and the Nicene Creeds, the foundational statements about who and what we understand Jesus to be, as part of telling Jesus' story. He suffered under Pontius Pilate, etc., etc., etc. Here, though, he's mostly the instrument by which Jesus' suffering was carried out. But in some Egyptian and Ethiopian Coptic traditions, Pilate's reluctance to put Jesus to death has inspired some stories that eventually make Pilate into a true believer. One story even has him summoned before the emperor himself, Tiberius, to explain himself of why he put one to death, and then was sentenced to execution himself. And the story goes on to say that as Pilate, was facing execution, he prays to Christ and is affirmed for his role in fulfilling the prophets by a voice from above. How's that for an end of the story? A little bit different, don't you think? All this while other early writings depict him as a diabolical ruler who is ultimately driven to his death for his hand in the Jesus affair. The church doesn't know what to do with Pilate. Nobody really knows what to do with Pilate. So let me make a suggestion at this point. Perhaps when we have such a person stripped bare as he is, the point of the story is not about the person themselves or the actual facts of the story so much as it is about the nature of the situation and the considerations of human nature that are at play at this point. In other words, maybe we need to stop trying to explain Pilate and see him for what he is, and see the ways that he explains a human predicament, even as he is trying to understand the perplexing plaintiff in front of him. As Pilate's internal and external turmoil play out, so too does the reality of our world and our challenges every day. Like the movie Inside Out, Pilate is put on display both inside and out to speak to how things are in the human soul. In our reading of the first part of the story last week, we sat with the crowds as Pilate gave them a choice. Who do you wish to release? Who do you embrace? The king of the Jews or Barabbas, the violent revolutionary? Barabbas is chosen. They choose the one who is changing the world by violence. They choose Barabbas. They stick with what they know and what makes good sense to them. In the language of John's own gospel, in chapter 3, verse 19, and this is a judgment, that the light has come into the world, and the people loved darkness rather than light, because their deeds were evil. And just to refresh yourself, that's right after John 3:16. God so loved the world that he sent God's only Son, but the world chose the violence instead. And we know that this is true. We condemn Jesus and ourselves when we choose the other, seemingly more powerful and pragmatic and expedient kings. And we do this all the time. We know the ways of the world are those of planning and politicking. We can see ourselves in the quandary that makes itself visible in Pilate and around him. We place our faith in our preferred path to prosperity rather than to heed the words of the one who bows to serve, recognizing that it is God's kingdom and God's future that really matter. We choose, well, this is how things are, because we struggle to see another way, and are frightened by the cross that comes so readily into view when we need to incarnate love. But even here, Pilate is not ready to condemn Jesus to death. So he tries negotiating. Let's settle some of the demands. He has Jesus flogged and tortured. Along the way, the soldiers ironically coronated him king. They crowned him with thorns and dressed him as he should be dressed. And ironically, they hit the nail on the head when they came proclaiming the king of the Jews, even as they mocked the very idea. This very cruelty condemns them even as it tells the truth that they don't entirely know. We know that we like cruelty as much as the next person. If you spend any time on an elementary school playground, we know that this is true. Those who mock always has something behind the mocking. Personally, I always found it fairly effective to take my bullies' mocking onto myself and agree with them, turning the joke back on them and to laugh along rather than to give them what they want, which is an agitated Bryce. We know that we are condemned for our cruelty and our judgment, and we know that this is at play too. And it continues. Pilate goes to the accusers again and declares Jesus innocent a second time. This is in verse 4 and following. Jesus comes out under his own power, still in control, dressed in the robe and the role that is his. Jesus was crowned here instead of condemned. This is a difference in John. The Synoptic Gospels tell Jesus being stripped, but John leaves him clothed and presenting himself. John emphasizes the intention of Jesus to remain in the way all the way to the cross. Here Jesus stays the course as a king. Pilate calls Jesus the man as in the Son of Man. The chief priests and police demand Pilate crucify him. And instead, they're simply given what they know. Presented with their crown came the innocent Son of Man, Jesus. His accusers fulfilled Jesus' own words. When you have lifted up the Son of Man, then you will realize who I am. They finally bring their charge against Jesus to Pilate. He claimed to be the Son of God. And Jesus' accusers cannot and will not see Jesus for what he is. And the Pharisees on the hand for Jesus, like the Pharisees on hand when Jesus healed a man born blind in chapter 9 of John, they condemn themselves by refusing to see God in their midst. They see what is there and they turn away. How often do we condemn ourselves the same way? Where does our blurred vision of the kingdom inhibit us from seeing its fullest dimension? By now, Pilate is more frightened than ever by the possibility that Jesus may be precisely who he says he is. Once again, Pilate, on the inside, asks John's Jesus the foundational question of the gospel. Where is it that you come from? But when Pilate asks this of Jesus, Jesus invites him again into the kingdom of truth, but is rejected. Now Jesus remains silent, nothing more to say. Pilate tries to demonstrate his power his way, claiming authority over life and death. Jesus again rightly places power where it belongs, with God alone, who ministers it not with threat and condemnation, but in and through grace. The offer remains, but Pilate cannot see it and cannot take it. How often do we deny ourselves the kingdom of truth by denying ourselves the promise of grace? It's simply accepting grace given. Pilate wants to release Jesus, but now those who brought Jesus to him for their vision of justice put Pilate on trial. They question his loyalty. They demand their political pound of flesh by threatening to take it out of Pilate's hide. Everyone who claims to be king is no friend to the emperor. On the day of preparation for Passover at noon, a detail that John puts there on purpose, all of this takes place. This noon is precisely the hour when the Passover lambs are slaughtered for their blood, and then the reenactment of dabbing the doorposts. And it's here, as the lambs of Passover are sacrificed, and the chief priests declared themselves to be better friends of the emperor than Pilate himself. Pilate capitulates to their demands and hands Jesus over to be crucified and lifted up. The chief priests who insisted that Jesus be put to death, proclaiming to be the Son of God, have claimed first Barabbas and now the emperor as their king. How do we condemn ourselves? By our alliances that we hold and the company that we keep. We could do this all day, and we can argue where Pilate resides in all of this drama and this story. But I think he is the perfect foil for the way that we are in this world. We encounter the Word, the true flesh of God among us, and we don't know what to make of him. We don't always know what is truth and where that truth might take us. We can so easily choose the means of a violent world rather than those of a loving kingdom as our way to power. We are quick to mock and show our cruelty, to hide our doubts and our fears. We hesitate to accept that there is another day and another way that changes the world, failing to see God with us. We are dubious that grace can even address our own wretched selves. We easily align ourselves with those who promise us the most to meet our ends rather than those who knows us and loves us best. These are the movements of Pilate, and these are the movements of us all. But here's the point. Jesus takes all of those movements, all of those impulses, all of those conflicts, all of those realities, and takes them to the cross with him. Jesus, who has been crowned rather than condemned, enthroned in glory on the cross, and issues forgiveness for it all. Jesus saves us from all the ways that we condemn ourselves, the ways that we put ourselves outside God's love, whether we deserve to be or not. Jesus embraces us and shows us that even the world's worst cannot and will not derail God's plan. My friends, this is good news. This is good hope. And this is our ultimate story. May we each reach beyond the ways that we condemn ourselves and see all that God is up to, even in the most unlikely of characters. Amen.